Hello again, everyone. I know it's only been a short time since the last upload in this series, but I felt very strongly that this essay's relevance to my previous essay made it a good idea to follow quickly on the heels of that other video. As such, here's the second part of a non-exhaustive attempt to characterize the relationship of conservatism to art critique, in particular using YouTube videos criticizing Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, as a lens. In the first 5 parts of this series, we discussed the rhetoric of many so-called critiques of this film and tried to access different components of how and why they operate in the way that they do. This has involved coining a number of phrases to describe specific, fallacious lines of reasoning and rhetorical appeals commonplace to these critiques. In the 6th part of this series, we discussed the ideas of bad faith critique and grifting, and in the 7th part, we saw how these behaviors can manifest in politically conservative ideology, and discussed where that might take fandom spaces when presented in the phenomena of wokespotting and Calvin ball rules. We'll go over these in summary in the final entry, but ultimately we need to return to the political component of this discourse one more time before we come back to ground ourselves in the film. The goals of this essay are to build on and expand the parts of the previous essay discussing political conservatism and art, specifically in a way that draws together and explains the observations made in the first 6 essays and the film and its critics. Check those out if you haven't already. At the end of our previous essay, we looked at some material that has been written about the political right, not just in terms of its present, but in terms of its past. I've often found Innuendo Studios' The Alt-Right Playbook videos provocative in their capacity to draw together different ideas and present them in plain view. In a sense, that video series, as well as some others he's worked on, felt as crucial to inspiring these essays as any other creator I've mentioned. This essay series is a sort of fandom menace playbook, and so in order to prepare ourselves for our next engagement, we need to get politically serious for a moment. Here's the model for society such as many conservatives understand it, taking some of their avowals at face value. They are frequently willing to entertain the leftward critique that society is hierarchical. Let's represent that society with a pyramid. This might, from a leftward perspective, imply some kind of scheme or grift, but the conservative mind prefers to parse this as a filter, where the majority of people are not excellent and many are inferior in some way, but a few are elite, and thus they establish themselves naturally at the head of society, with the most privilege, power, influence, and success. This is their justification for capitalism, patriarchy, and any other historical system that might have its conservative adherents. One may be conservative in one of those arenas and not in others. While it is the prerogative of the bullheaded to deny allegations of faults in their own ideals, one major flaw here that frequently goes unacknowledged by conservatives is how nakedly self-serving this justification is. It essentially relies on choosing by way of one's own values what is or is not the nature of people in the world, because this is how one supposedly knows the system is filtering correctly. Conservatives largely believe this is true, and exceptions tend to be personal or imposed. The wrong groups are not in power, but if we aren't careful they might be, and all social problems can conveniently be traced back to the problems of individuals, with the logical flaw here, of course, being twofold. It is selective reasoning to see flaws in some groups and not in others, which conservatives implicitly do by looking at a system that discriminates against some groups and calling that separating the wheat from the chaff. They might not call it discrimination, but they do look at a system where some people statistically are filtered in correlation with some of their identities and demographic membership. See how conservatives locate issues of black poverty as being causally related to black culture. The other logical fault with that reasoning is that it's not just selective, it's presumptuous. And as a justification for what it's given to justify, it means the conservative proposition for how to run a society is on shaky ground. These two flaws are connected. The presumption of conservatives in that scenario tends to be that some people are simply apparently out of their place, and this is an offense to the order of things. And indeed, often that this is the work of their ideological competitors, who they are well aware attribute societal hierarchy on a large enough scale to discrimination between groups. This is one of a few reasons why, despite in many places being deeply invested in religious institutions, so many American conservatives are against so-called collectivism. The link between modern conservatism and fascism in this sense to say nothing of any others, is that logically, if a person's deserved status in society is being arbitrated based on their individual merit, then there's a degree to which, between the two ideologies, conservatism avoids fascism by displacing the justification for discriminatory outcomes that have a causal association with demographics of persons onto individuals, usually with a moral element. This feels logical to them because they have already chosen to believe that those who succeed, at least those whom they favor, do so due to their merit. Conservatives are tempted towards bigotry by their own logic, for example, because they would prefer to believe they live in a society without deep racial inequity that would indict its institutions and potentially its leaders and founders. They opt to explain inequity by way of pointing to personal failings. However, because there are material roots to discrimination, these explanations tend to crop up as denials, which roots the conservatives ideologically in justifying inequity. Keen to deny things like anti-blackness in media, the economy, and government, they, by manner of their own twisted logic, become its further perpetrators, because in an effort to develop a sense of who belongs where in society that justifies social structures writ large, they in turn develop a posture of suspicion towards black success in media, the economy, and government. This is how the conservative posture of pointing at forced diversity has developed. Of course, in American racial relations, as in many other places, suspicion towards black success or the success of any racial minority carries with it the component normativity of white success or the success of the dominant racial majority. This carries over for similar ways of thinking regarding sex, gender, nationality, wealth, etc. Importantly, this posture is implicitly therefore also the posture of rationalizing white supremacy, and any other such similar supremacies. Anyone of any background can believe in it because all it requires is the aforementioned posture and component social norms. If you live in a certain kind of society and think this way, you're a hop, skip, and a jump away from believing in the idea of a master race. Only the conservative predilection to source group failings to incidental personal failings separates them from this way of thinking, but on a large enough scale, forwarding the posture itself as a message on social media to large enough audiences conditions those people into believing in the general shape of the argument, which can cause them to take it in the context of group identity. Certainly, I think the knee-jerk backlash to minority identities being represented in media, just like the conservative skepticism of the success of members of minority groups, is a part of that. All of this could easily lead to the one rather obvious conclusion that mainstream conservatism as we know it is itself deeply fallacious, that its defenses of existing social orders are not with evidence logically deduced from real observation, but that they are instead a curated series of rationalizations of a selective number of elements of the status quo. It might also lead one to reasonably conclude that not only are conservatives deeply troubled at the level of their own logic by a trend towards deeply hateful, bigoted, and oppressive supremacist ideology, but that such a strain of thought even has an indirect connection with liberal ideology through the same means. In fact, all of that is the truth. But the other truth here is that this is how the Gamergate, Comicsgate, Fandom Menace, and other similar loose groups of channels have become part of the alt-right pipeline. They specifically curated a way of thinking that serves illogical rationalizations of inequality and which conditions the audience into having a number of the prerequisite beliefs of the alt-right. They're just missing a crucial component. The component those would-be alt-righters in many of these audiences are missing is the idea of conspiracy. Remember that pyramid that I mentioned? If the conservative becomes willing to believe that on some level society's meritocratic structure is being undermined by forces outside it, or at the very top, usually infiltrators or shadowy hidden figures, they have begun to ask a form of the Jewish question. For the historical Nazis and their modern inheritors, the Jewish question was a way of sourcing this idea that the ills of society were being conspiratorially introduced by manipulators for their personal benefit to a racially and religiously coded group. Because the structure of society cannot be questioned, instead any admission of its inequities occurring along demographic lines has to be both a validation of the privileged groups and located in the actions of a pretender or infiltrator group. It's called the socialism of fools for a reason. Ben Shapiro is an interesting figure because he is an anti-black, anti-Arab, and generally racist and anti-queer Jewish and Christian supremacist. He tends to cast this sentiment as a Judeo-Christian traditionalism, selectively aligning his politics with portions of Abrahamic traditions which can be cast as copacetic with his other values. None of this information on Ben is new, and you can feel free to visit the sources in the description and bibliography for references to these facts. However, Ben's status as a character in the story is uniquely fascinating. An aspiring writer and artist, Ben has largely failed to make his impact in literature or films, despite his political tendencies' frequent rationalization that markets make merit. But his ability to vacillate between mutually contradictory positions has, per our previous discussion of Calvin Ball rules and bad faith argumentation, had very little effect on his success at preaching to the choir. Even a hack can make waves if he's well funded. I felt the need to lead with a discussion of conservatism and self-serving political rhetoric because these traits characterize Ben's work to his core. He is, in terms of his position in media, a bit of an odd man out in this series. Even obvious conservatives like Mr. Reagan or Shadiversity, or more figures with veiled conservative tendencies like the critical drinker, really don't measure up to Ben's career dedication to political conservatism. On the one hand, this makes him a perfect contributor to just one entry in this series. Ben throws much of what I just told you into a different light entirely. Much of my aforementioned descriptions of conservatism relied on the idea that conservatives argue their positions in some degree of good faith, that when they engage in rationalization, they may be telling the whole truth as they see it, or they may be lying, but either way their error in thinking at some point is truly an error, and reveals something about them. If a conservative really does hold beliefs that are bigoted, not just implicitly but with real active animus behind them, then we would need to reconsider this posture, the frailty of the conservative positions notwithstanding. I want you all to think about that as we engage with what Ben had to say about this film.
When we left The Force Awakens, Rey had randomly been amazing at everything. She was the ultimate Mary Sue in science fiction literature. She literally came out of nowhere and was incredible with a lightsaber, such that Kylo Ren, who's supposed to be a guy trained in his youth about the Force, trained in using a lightsaber, gets defeated by her in a lightsaber battle the first time she has literally ever picked up a lightsaber, which is stupid.
This is a fantastic opportunity to address the common talking point of Rey's status as a Mary Sue, which Ben brings up when he, like Shad, recaps the previous film. The Mary Sue is a label originating in Star Trek fanfiction, which spread across online discussions about fanfiction like wildfire. The common traits of a Mary Sue are that the character is usually female, usually an author's self-insert, broadly popular among other characters, morally uncomplicated in the context of the narrative, and competent at most tasks while not having major or mentioned character flaws. The literary function of the Mary Sue is to present a positive self-insert for the writer to engage with in the setting, which has more utility in fanfiction than original work. If we look at these 6 traits of a Mary Sue, which were about the most basic ones I thought I could stick to and still keep everyone on the same page, we can see which ones Rey matches. First, Rey is definitely female, so she clears that one. On the other hand, it's difficult to identify whether Rey is the self-insert of any of the writers, and in the case of the director, I would guess not. If Rey was J.J. Abrams' self-insert, she'd presumably be a male Mary Sue equivalent, commonly a Gary Stu, although that term was largely an afterthought to the original. For our next point, we'll have to ask, is Rey popular among all the other characters? For a bit of charitability, let's assume we're only talking about characters who are protagonists at some point in the sequel trilogy. So that would mean Han, Leia, Luke, Chewie, C-3PO, R2-D2, Poe, BB-8, Finn, Rose, Lando, and Kylo Ren. That's 12 characters, and I think she technically lands most of their approval at some point, but 2 of them are more hard-won. Kylo tortures and fights Rey in several scenes, and Luke is outright disrespectful to Rey when they first meet, so Rey's status as a Mary Sue for this point is arguably strongest in Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Then maybe the case gets a little bit weaker in Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and finally this point is probably the weakest in Episode 8, The Last Jedi. The case is also weakest in The Last Jedi for moral complexity, as Rey's temptation to the dark side is in this film a product of her own potential and her own desire to resolve her questions about her identity. As Luke puts it, she goes straight to the dark. The Rise of Skywalker is probably second in this regard, since Rey's dark side powers are also present in that film, whereas they had yet to be introduced in The Force Awakens. In terms of Rey's competency, she's a mixed bag. On the one hand, she's established in the beginning of the trilogy to have certain strengths in accordance with her lifestyle. She dismantles and works on starships, and she has had to fend for herself for a long time. Because of this, it's communicated to us early on that Rey has experience with ships and hand-to-hand combat. However, because of her lifestyle, she's also socially naive, which leads to her trying to bail when she first finds Luke's old lightsaber in The Force Awakens, as well as being manipulated by Snoke and Kylo Ren. She doesn't appear to have many real skills with a blaster for the majority, if not all, of the trilogy, and her skills with a lightsaber are owed to her awakened Force talents and existing hand-to-hand combat skills. She only beats Kylo after he's been shot directly in the abdomen with a weapon that we've seen lift grown men off their feet and kill them instantly. And even then, the landmass of Starkiller Base actually breaks apart to separate her from him, allowing her to escape. There's also plenty of moral complications to Rey's character, and issues of competency that could be counted as character flaws. However, one thing worth considering is that I do think Rey, in terms of her aspirations, behavior towards characters from the original trilogy, and overall character writing, does function as someone's insert. She's a likely candidate for audience surrogate. On those grounds, she might score something closer to a 2 out of 6, which in my opinion is interesting, but still doesn't do much to justify the label. Intriguingly, however, the most commonly cited justifications for Rey's status as a Mary Sue are not her endearment to other characters or her status as a potential audience surrogate, but rather instances of her competency which are often exaggerated to make the point. But why do we have to exaggerate? It makes the whole argument seem weaker on its merits. I'd simply call Rey an audience surrogate, which is the more technical name in the craft, and be done with it. Ben doesn't seem to have even thought of this when he made his video. I suppose no one has ever accused Ben Shapiro of understanding narrative craft, but I think it's telling how near ubiquitous much of his commentary is, almost as if many commentators shared many of his priors.
And then they free the animals who have been abused. Oh, this is how we know the rebels are good guys, because they don't like animals being abused, right? Okay, great. Okay, this is a far cry, by the way, from Empire Strikes Back, where Han literally cuts open the belly of a what is it? Of a tauntaun, thank you, and stuffs Luke inside of it, right? But now we have to make sure that all of the rights of the animals are upheld, because this is deeply important. Listen, I'm for animal rights, but what does Star Wars have to do with animal rights? Like, what the hell? And Finn turns to Rose and he says, "Well, I guess it was worth it." You mean losing the entire galaxy was worth you going there to free a few camel horses that will be recaptured 5 seconds from now? Was that the thing that was worth it? And then, the worst line in the film, Rose turns to him, she takes a saddle off the camel horse dog, and she goes, "Now it's worth it." What? No, it's not. Like, it's not. Like, your whole job here is to get this hacker guy so you can go back to fake Death Star and hack the program. No.
Note the subtle recharacterization of the two films Ben compares here. On the one hand, Ben talks about The Empire Strikes Back as if Han Solo was slaughtering a live tauntaun, but the film establishes how and why his tauntaun was dying, and he only used its corpse to keep Luke shielded from the elements while he set up their camp. On the other hand, Ben takes exception to the themes around animal cruelty, and engages in a little Holdo maneuvering of his own, see Part 5 of this series, so he can deny any knowledge of the relevance of animal abuse. What's interesting about this is that not only is the film somehow not allowed to establish its own themes to contribute to the series as a rule, it's also required to explain itself to a ridiculous degree. The other Star Wars films tell us the Force binds all living things, and so we are luminous beings not bound by matter, that life feeds our connection to the Force from the big to the small. The Last Jedi also establishes this extremely directly in dialogue between Luke and Rey, but Ben can engage in a little Setsuna sophistry of his own here by denouncing those lessons and what a terrible teacher Luke is in one part of his video, while refusing to take them into account in the next part of his video. You can also catch a humorous slip-up from Ben here where he's still halfway into his review and can't fully distinguish between plot points from The Force Awakens, which is the movie with what he calls the fake Death Star, and The Last Jedi, where the destination of those characters is Snoke's ship, the Supremacy. Perhaps most provocative of these critiques from Ben is his utter unwillingness to not only place scenes in the context of other scenes, but also to understand even very meager and straightforward elements of symbolism when it suits him. Finn and Rose break out of prison but can't make it far, and they free the animals, they're called Fathirs by the way, to cause enough chaos to help them escape. There's a decent amount of destruction, and it's hard to know whether Canto Bight even has a police force that would be up to the task of catching the Fathirs beyond the couple cops that we see, since they're so easily overwhelmed by them and are in such disarray during the escape. I suppose it's up to viewer interpretation, but Finn and Rose didn't come here to Canto Bight to free slaves, and they aren't prepared to. In fact, it's the other way around. They need the help of the slave children to free the Fathirs so they can escape. It's a loose echo of a plot point from The Phantom Menace, but the destruction it causes and the removal of the saddle aren't meant to destroy all of Canto Bight any more than they're meant to free every oppressed person or animal in it. What these scenes do is function as an affirmation of a cause that is greater than our heroes or even their mission. This is affirmed in a subsequent scene when the hacker DJ shows Finn and Rose that the ship they're on belonged to someone who dealt weapons to both the Resistance and the First Order. The film is telling us that, like the Jedi, the Resistance is in a morally complicated situation. But there are higher and better ideals to cling to than pure military victory over their enemies, a fact which is affirmed across the film's entire runtime.
My biggest problem with the entire series is what they can't decide in Star Wars land whether they wanted to benefit from nostalgia, whether they want to make it a nostalgia-centric series, or they wanted to launch something new. And so they decided to do both. And what they ended up doing in the process was killing all of the old things in preparation for the new. And that's nasty to my childhood, okay? I come for the nostalgia because I thought that the first, the new episodes that George Lucas made were terrible. The stuff I like is episode 4, 5, 6, right? The stuff that everybody likes is New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Couldn't care less about Phantom Menace or Revenge of the Sith or any of that crap. Okay, 4, 5, and 6 are where it's at. So I grew up with Han Solo. I grew up with Luke Skywalker. I grew up with Princess Leia. In fact, my sister's middle name, one of my sister's middle names is Leia because I was such a big Star Wars fan, because my parents asked me what I thought her middle name should be, and I picked Leia because I was a big Star Wars fan. Okay, so I am a huge Star Wars nut. In the last movie, they killed off Han Solo for no reason. They turned Han Solo, who is one of the coolest, most roguish figures who becomes honorable in film lore, they turn him into a loser single dad who can't hold his crap together and gets killed by his whiny brat son for no reason at all.
I'm not going to touch Ben's frankly Freudian remark about his sister, but for this and for other reasons you should be at this time experiencing a sense of déjà vu if you recall the previous essays. Ben is running through the same motions that Shadiversity ran through when discussing The Force Awakens, which is not the same film as The Last Jedi, but does share a couple common themes. Like both Shadiversity and The Critical Drinker, Ben Shapiro plays to fears of emasculation, which it must be said offers some explanation for why he would be so concerned with Mary Sue's when he can barely string together an analysis that accounts for the plot of The Force Awakens. Like Mahler, Ben takes something he either would rather not explain for his argument's convenience, or which it doesn't occur to him to explain, or with which he lacks the literacy to engage, and he calls it random. Like the cut from Luke to Kylo when asking about Han's fate, Han's death at his son's hands isn't random. The film is clearly mirroring a plot element from the original trilogy, as well as one from the prequel trilogy, where Luke attempted to turn his father from the dark side. Anakin began to experience his fall to the dark side when his mother died. Both children experience a parent dying in their arms, and this is affirmed in Kylo Ren's writing, but in a way that gives Han the motives of Luke, and Kylo the supposed outcome, at least for the duration of The Force Awakens, of Anakin. This is a genuinely poetic element of the writing of the Star Wars sequel trilogy, but Ben can only parse it as a humiliation. Shapiro is an expression of a broader right-wing tendency to, in their terms, embrace and promote certain traditions, and in a more literal sense, attempt to assert themselves as the real inheritors of popular elements of a common culture. This way of thinking carries with it not only the associated assertions of in-group and out-group typologies, but also the implication that our now traditions that we might conserve are themselves compatible with ideological conservatism. Shapiro and many of his fellows at both the Daily Wire and in Politics and Media are, for a strong example, not secularists. Many of them frequently emphasize the need for one kind of religiously dominated society or another, if not an all-out theocratic society, up to and including real appeals to the potential benefits of a dictatorship or monarchy. These are much more compatible with the avowed values of a number of Confederate American thinkers than, say, the Renaissance artists whose work inspired a shift from revering the divine to revering the human, from pondering the spirit to observing the world, qualities in direct contradiction with conservatives of both their own era and many subsequent eras as well. In art education, this wrinkle in cultural historiography is uncontroversial. It's literally taught in some elementary schools and is, at the university level, more of a redundant reminder of what most American students are educated to know. It's no secret as to why targeting the education system is such a committed strategy of contemporary political movements up to and including the practices of Shapiro's peers, Dennis Prager and Chaya Raichik. The trick, in other words, of conservative punditry is in convincing the public to support theoretical ideals and practical efforts which violate and destroy the very thing that they purport to save and create. It's not even a stretch to say that this is what George Lucas directly shows Darth Sidious doing to Anakin Skywalker. Palpatine himself is an incredibly unsubtle parallel for several figures in the modern conservative movement, depending on which film is in consideration, a fact uncontroversial but conveniently ignored by critics who suggest Star Wars has gone woke in some way. Lucas has been accused of having many flaws as an artist, but I've always felt his flaws were fundamental to the joy and beauty of what he created. But an appreciation for that art would be aided by public discourse that spreads literacy of the medium as opposed to obscurantism, the act of cordoning off deeper inquests into the whys and wherefores of how we ascertain the meaning in a work of art. Ultimately, I keep wanting to come back to Ben's rhetoric on the pointlessness of and the humiliation of death as it occurs in the Star Wars sequels. Conservatism, specifically fascist conservatism, has a fetish for death in the sense that, as Sartre puts it, the anti-Semite appreciates the durability of a stone, and this wish is reflective of a further wish not to change. But why resist change? Change is the marker of danger where safety is the present, and eventually change is death, finally and always. With such surety, the conservatives' all-too-human prohibition on death develops into a maladaptive prohibition on change. Fascism, then, is the fulfillment of a tantalizing violation that follows such absolutely certain prohibition, and like all fetishes, it is a transformation. The skydiver engages the fetish of death by being in apparent or real individual danger, but with an option for rescue in the parachute. The fascist engages the fetish for death by fulfilling it not in the individual self, but in the group other. This is the first reason why fascists describe themselves as already being in conflict with another outgroup as a matter of life and death. The second is the need for provocative justification. This justification is really a rationalization post hoc, like victim blaming in its appeal to reversing the causal chain of victim and offender. Of course that other means to do us fatal harm, the fascist tells us. Look with your eyes and you'll see why it's their fault. What were they wearing? The reactionary has an ego investment in their social environment because they are human, like anyone else. Specific to them is the character of their ego investment in an oppressive order, but any of us are capable of the same in theory. When that system is threatened, they feel threatened. A proposed end to that system can, depending on their context, make them feel like they are being threatened with experiencing death at the level of their self-concept, their ego. But this is a human entertainment. Conservatism does not originate exclusively with a fetishistic relationship of death fulfilling itself through practice, which is why skydivers are not all to a person terrible human beings, or why not every person engaged with violence or the fetishization thereof, either as partialism or as power manifesting in the gun, the corpse, the bomb, etc., is indicted by proximity to moral wrongdoing. We must return to Corey Robin's excellent book, accordingly far less concerned with psychology and far more with philosophy and policy, for a more accurate idea. Where does this psychological impulse find itself translated in conservatism? A common insinuation was the temptation to regain power as experienced in its loss through a threat to privilege. This, like the psychological question, is too personal. It cannot respond to the real question of ideology, that at some level the conservative has an impulse, even where not personally relevant, to see as beautiful and desirable the submission of one to another, the elevation of one above another. Indeed, Robin maintains that, quote, no conservative opposes change as such or defends order as such. The violence in conservatism is also directed at the old order. So why traditionalism? And why so frequently now fascism? It appears a consistent presumption of conservatives that the old order is not itself. That is to say that in one case America is the greatest country on earth, but she also needs us to make her great again. There is, in this way, a kind of symmetry on the modern right. A right-wing stochastic terrorist acts out the violence and the ideals of his favored right-wing provocateurs, and he and the provocateur both see themselves as affirming and extending what is good in their tradition by either doing or saying what others will not. It is not change that is the problem, but rather that change's proximity to institutional hierarchy that makes so many people into opportunists who must save the dream, as it were. This is actually condemned in the Star Wars sequels. The First Order is a revivalist and dictatorial power dominating through sheer might. However, like so many critics of these films, the antagonists experience a humiliation which their forefathers did not, and this ripens their fury even as its portrayal provokes denial in the audience. When Kylo Ren tosses General Hux around, when Poe Dameron taunts him, the machismo of his military professionalism and might collapse, and the reactionary critic experiences an eerie mirroring, seeing the self through another. He must deny it. He needs to deny it. He cannot acknowledge that little nagging voice that says, "You are weaker than your father, Ben. You don't even look like him." There's one more piece to the puzzle that is Ben's critique of The Last Jedi. He especially pleads for the sensation of nostalgia in much of what he says, either explicitly or implicitly. This nostalgia is an animating force for much political reaction, from conservatism to fascism. You may have heard an adage that runs this gambit. Strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. The phrasing has been popularized by neo-Nazi meme accounts online, but appeals to a certain sense of emasculation, that men today are weaker than their fathers, but they're called upon to become strong in the face of a civilizational peril. In consort with this romantic ideal, you may sometimes see the quote displayed alongside the images from a series of paintings by Thomas Cole, collectively dubbed The Course of Empire. It's a tragic and appealing notion to some. But hard times don't just make strong men. They also make reactionaries who compulsively need to view themselves as strong men. And reactionaries don't make good times. They make suicide cults. Their actions are justified by reference to an imagined past which is impossible to revisit, rejoining their ideals to their frequent values of a prelapsarian Edenic vision that precedes mankind's encounter with immorality. To think and behave in this way is to concede more than rationality. It is a concession of our ability to build positive, healthy social bonds. The social suicide precedes the political suicide. The black pill precedes the mass shooting. Only living eyes can begin to look for the door. If you're still here, now is the time to leave.